folks. It's Zach Elliott at Feel Free to Argue. Wanted to spend some time talking about Tim Geithner and the Federal Reserve. I think it's interesting that the appointments that I thought should be controversial, like Admiral Dennis Blair, had not turned out to be controversial at all. I think Tim Geithner actually is another perfect example of someone who should have been looked at a lot more seriously. But of course, his confirmation sailed through the other day. I think it was at least a 2/3 majority in the Senate voting for confirmation. Thankfully, Russ Feingold, who usually does not expend capital on appointments, actually voted against him. So I was very pleased to see that. My senator, as usual, is looking out for the American people, whenever he doesn't have a horse he needs to trade in order to get something done for his constituents. But he doesn't do that very often. I think it's interesting because Geithner is yet another example of what seems to be the prevailing notion that the way in which you are qualified to do something in government is by totally screwing up something similar in the recent past. For those of you who don't know, Geithner, before he was tapped to be Obama's Treasury Secretary, was in charge of the New York Federal Reserve for several years. And what's so interesting about this is that he's basically at ground zero for the financial crisis. And nobody really seemed to ask any real questions. Well, I mean, not that, penetrated through to like the great majority of American people to the point where they were really opposing this. And everybody should have, actually. Geithner basically established that he didn't know what he was doing when he was in New York. I want to read you some bits from an article called Unasked Crisis Questions for Treasury Nominee by a guy named Lawrence Steffi, Houston Chronicle. Sometimes I wish I were a senator. Then I could actually ask the questions I find myself shouting at the TV during confirmation hearings. This week, for example, members of the Senate Finance Committee badgered Timothy Geithner about dodging personal income taxes. They were fair questioners. Geithner is about to become head of the department that, among other things, collects taxes. It's no job for a tax cheat. But there's a more pertinent question, one that gets to the overwhelming matter at hand, the handling of the federal bank bailout. For 5 years, Geithner has been president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. As a regional Fed head, he supervised banks in his district, a duty that includes monitoring how they're managing risk and ensuring that they have enough capital. Yet no one on the committee asked, what about Citigroup? Citi, the largest bank in the land, is essentially disassembling itself. The once great financial supermarket, whose creation supposedly heralded a new banking era, is now a shambles, a Wall Street Winn-Dixie, a broken shadow of its former self. Last week, Citi announced plans to split into two after losing almost $8.3 billion, its fifth consecutive quarterly loss. Citi, as we all know, did a poor job of risk management. But under Geithner, the New York Fed actually lifted a requirement that Citi provide it with quarterly risk reports. The investigative website ProPublica reported. I'll put a link to that article, by the way. It's a very good article, the ProPublica one. That requirement, by the way, grew out of Citi's settlement with the Securities and Exchange Commission as an enabler of Enron's off-balance sheet shenanigans. Nor was Citi's capital adequate. Yet, the New York Fed never took enforcement action and actually loosened the rules by which Citi accounted for capital. Is that, Mr. Geithner, part of the reason taxpayers had to hand Citi $25 billion in October and another $20 billion last week? Meanwhile, Bank of America also got a second helping of our money, another $20 billion to aid its digestion of Merrill Lynch. So Citi shrinks and Bank of America grows, and both get $20 billion. The bailout has become a two-headed horse, both ends headed in different directions. Which path, Mr. Geithner, is the right one? And why? Geithner told the committee that President Barack Obama would unveil a comprehensive plan for fixing the economy and combating the recession in a matter of weeks. Weeks? Why weeks? Geithner was among the first nominees Obama announced, way back in late November. Yet, we are still weeks from a plan? Can we get a few specifics, even if they're in a rough draft? A day before the hearings, the markets hit their lowest since 1995, and job losses are being measured in the thousands per day. Yet instead of answers, we got platitudes. The ultimate costs of this crisis will be greater if we do not act with sufficient strength now, Geithner said. In a crisis of this magnitude, the most prudent course is the most forceful course. What sort of force? How will it be administered? And what's the conversion rate for a unit of such economic force to dollars? Serious questions remain about Geithner's role in policing the banks at the heart of the crisis. Did he allow Citi to crumble? How many more institutions face the same fate? Will these failures help the crisis or make it worse? Is Geithner up to the task? We don't know the answers because no matter how loudly I yelled at the TV, the senators did not ask the right questions. Now, the clearest evidence that we have that the banks aren't doing anything approaching what we wanted them to do was on Democracy Now! And they were reporting on the Wall Street Journal. Here we go. In economic news, the Wall Street Journal reports lending at many of the nation's largest banks fell in recent months, even after the government gave them $148 billion that was intended to make loans more readily available. Both Bank of America and Citigroup reduced their lending, despite receiving $45 billion from the government. Duke University professor Campbell Harvey said the government's effort to jumpstart lending have failed. Harvey said, basically, we have dropped a huge amount of money, and we have nothing to show for what we actually wanted to happen. Most banks have refused to say how they have spent the billions of dollars in handouts. When Congress approved the massive bailout, it attached nearly no strings to the money, and the Treasury Department never asked the banks how it would be spent. So, I think we have a lot of problems here. And not only have we spent a huge amount of money already, and we have no guarantees that it would be spent in a responsible way, and we already have substantial information saying it was not spent in the way that we said it was intended to be spent. So, I don't know why anybody thinks Geithner's going to solve this problem. I really don't. Because, I mean, here is a guy who was at the absolute center of the financial crisis and did the exactly wrong things. Now, I mean, you could say, oh, well, that's easy to look back. But you know what? They're going to be working blind in the future right now. They're going to be making plans, and they're going to have some reasonable expectation that these plans are going to turn out well. So, we're always talking about an unknown future. And I just don't feel comfortable having Geithner in charge of this right now. I wish that he had gotten knocked down, and I don't know, we'll see what he and Obama come up with. But if it's anything like the way he managed the Fed in New York, I think we have more disasters heading our way. But as always, you can feel free to argue.